Good afternoon, Sean here from Mountains Garage. This video is going to kind of be a repeat because I already did one on assembling a 9-inch Ford, and then I did a few follow-ups on a few details, but I was doing one today start to finish, and I went ahead and made another one, really getting down into the finite details of the way I do it. Again, everything's what you're comfortable with and how you do it, but follow along. And I'm going to post it anyway. I was watching some videos of a guy at a transmission shop, and he's always working on transmissions, so it's not that unusual that I'm working on another rear end. But this will probably be it for at least 9-inch Fords. I recently did an 8 3/4 Mopar. Very similar to a 9-inch Ford. Better in a couple areas, not my favorite in the rest of it. And I got a big Toyota to do, which is kind of like, same idea, a dropout. I kind of like the dropouts because they don't take up much space when I'm here working on them. That's it. Enjoy the video. Like and subscribe. Thanks, bye. With the expansion rate of aluminum, I'm sure they machine the bores for the bearing race on an aluminum, in this case Daytona pinion support, very tight. They go in hard, I'm not going to lie. So I find, this isn't rocket science, a little bit of warming with a propane torch on the aluminum, I could hold it on there all day and never hurt it. And my bench is always cold, so I could refrigerate that, but there's no need. I just let that sit on the bench and get cool and warm that up. Try not to catch my rag on fire. I'm eventually going to pound on it, so I want to protect the aluminum, so I'll take my chances not setting a fire. And it usually goes in pretty slick. Alright, that went pretty well. It's still warm, but I don't like to press it due to the thin area right here. I mean, it's pretty strong because it's tapered, but when I warm it up, I can just use this and pretty much just whack it in there and then use an old race to set it down all the way. It's pretty much flush anyway. When you got a press, you can never have enough round things. Or installing bearings, I should say. Because I didn't use a press that time. But I will use a press next, because next I need to put the inner bearing on the pinion. That's a 9-inch Ford, so the shims actually go on the whole support in the case to shim the pinion depth. So you don't have to worry about putting a shim under the bearing. The only thing you have to worry about in a stock Ford carrier, like that one right there, both bearings, inner and outer, on the pinion are the same size. On a Daytona pinion support, which this is, the outer is still the same small one, and the inner is what I'll have to call medium size, because if this was a big pinion, this is a small pinion 28 spline. If it was a 35 spline big pinion, the bearings dwarf both of these. They're absolutely huge. So I lube, because you can never have too much lube. I got this super high-tech piece of roll cage tubing that I use to press the bearing down on, just like that, in the press. My old press is an antique, but still gets the job done with a super modern Harbor Freight bottle jack. Again, round things. You can never have enough round things, because you never know what operation you're going to have to do. So over the years, I collected stuff, dumpster finds, whatever it takes. I absolutely had my mind blown the other day, in a good way. Pinion depth, I've talked about it before. There's about 4 methods you can use. Typically, this is a brand new ring and pinion. There's some hieroglyphics on the end of it. That 113, I know for a 9-inch Ford, is going to be in my range of numbers, so I can assume the 113 is my depth. And I'll put it in at 113, and I expect the pattern to be good. Because they always tell you to check the pattern afterwards, even though they, gave you the depth they lapped it in. This is run on a big machine. Each ring and pinion is a match set, because they're running on a machine, and they do some whatever magic to attempt to make them quiet and harmonious with each other. So of the 4 methods, I often wondered if they're running on this big elaborate machine, and for instance, if this didn't have any numbers on it, you measure your head thickness, you look up the master housing dimension all rear ends have this universal, well, it's not universal, when they spec out a housing or they build a housing, this is some kind of nomenclature they have, and that's how they work from. They work off that number. So in this, if you didn't have any numbers, you'd measure the head thickness, you look up that master housing dimension, your actual installed height, you do the math. So all this time, I mean, I'm been around a while, I figured if they do go through all this, why don't they just tell you what shim to put in it? If there's an actual master housing dimension, all these things should be cut pretty much the same, kind of like bearings. The bearings are all, regardless of the brand, they're all the same dimension. I always thought that would be too easy. Well, the other day, this ring and pinion showed up, and in the box is a sheet for every rear end that they make a ring and pinion for. They said they use an elaborate lapping process, and it tells you what shim to use. This is for an 8 3/4 Mopar. It said to use a 34,000 shim, and when I ran the pattern, it was flawless. I mean, better than I usually get after a couple tries. I'm just kidding, but you know what I mean. It was easy. And in this case, the bearing holds the shim. The shim is under the bearing on the inner pinion bearing, so you got to keep taking it off if you're wrong. But in blind faith, I went ahead and followed the instructions, and it worked out. Today I'm working on this ring and pinion. I got this brand new Auburn, if you can read it. Beautiful box. Inside that box is this less impressive box. And the ring gear is, I haven't touched it. It's just floating around in there like that, kind of beating through on the pinion, which is only contained in this flap here. That's not impressive. Typically they're packed in styrofoam. But the ring and pinion itself will be fine, I'm sure. But yeah, they told me the shim. That's awesome. I think I'll buy more of that brand. The solid pinion spacer kit, which replaces a crush sleeve. I've covered this a couple times, but it's right in front of me today, so why not? I press my bearing on. These are the shims that come in the kit. So I just did a little guesstimate. I like to put the shims under, and then the fat spacer over. Got the tiny amount of lube on it. I'll have to use my custom piece of tubing to just bang that bearing on there. And then I got the yoke set up with a whole bunch of washers, so I don't have to run the nut down very far. And I'm just going to tighten it up and check the drag. And here's how it went down. I used every shim that came in the kit for this particular, it's a Yukon aluminum Daytona pinion support, and I was still too tight. So I got an assortment from other kits I've done. I kept adding 15,000 at a time, and the second 15,000 shim, it had the drag that a broke-in bearing should have. So these are new bearings, so I needed to be a little tighter than that. So I took out the 15, put in a 7,000ths, and it was too tight. It wouldn't even turn. That's how critical this is. And you got to be able to, don't be scared. You got to gun this as tight as you're going to leave it when the yoke's on for real. Otherwise you're going to get false readings. If you just kind of go semi-tight by hand and think your drag is good, when you finally tighten that nut up, it's not going to turn. So anyway, 15 was a good broken in feel. 7 wouldn't even turn. I put a 12 in it and it's perfect. It should break right in. So that's how close it is. You know, tolerance-wise, these bearings have a tendency to get tight in a hurry. Unlike your side adjusters on your Carrier, you can give those quite a few flats of preload and they still spin. Just the way it's designed, I guess. This is a closer situation. Anyway, now I'm ready to put the seal in, wrap it up for good. All right, we're really breaking it down today. To slinger or not to slinger? Ford sometimes put a slinger under the yoke on top of the bearing. I recently bought a 4-pack of these. They fit Dana 44, I think 10 and a 1025 Sterling rear ends. They fit a whole bunch of rear ends if you look it up. I've run more without than with. I don't think it matters a bit, to be honest with you, but I got them, so I'm going to put one in this one. I've talked about packing this cavity right here. There's a spring in there that's going to hold the tension on where it rides on the yoke. I put good old-fashioned Vaseline That prevents you from knocking that spring out, because we're going to have to, tap on it to beat it in there. Now, it should go in 1 or 2 hits. I used to work with an old guy. We used to, count this, how many times he'd hit a seal. 17 was his magic number most of the time. Yeah. So, you're going to lube up things for real. That's my shim, solid shim and spacer package. Just floats on there. I like to put the spacers underneath. I think I covered that 4 times already. I got my slinger in there. I put a little bit of sealer all the way around just on the top of these where the yoke goes over, because I notice the factory does that on a lot of rear ends, keep oil from seeping out there. And also, your new pinion nut has sealer stuff on it, so it should seal on the yoke itself pretty well. Plus, a little bit may bleed out here, but I don't. When I talk sealer, I've mentioned it. I only put a skim coat. So, otherwise, again, I've done it without doing that. If it was a race car, I probably wouldn't. I don't know. Depends on what kind of race car, I guess. If you're gonna have it apart all the time, you don't want to deal with old silicone. This is gonna go together and hopefully be together for a long time. That's it. More uses for round things. This is my seal driver. It pushes right on the edge. It's just a piece of aluminum pipe I dug out of a dumpster, but it works perfect for a 9-inch Ford. So now, I prefer to install the seal on the bench. Don't forget to put your bearing and slinger in there if you choose. You definitely gotta have the bearing either way. You could have this sitting on the pinion and try to put the seal in around it. It works too, especially with the long driver like that. That's why it's so long. But now you've elected, like me, to put the seal in on the bench, and that outer bearing's kind of a push fit under there. How are you going to get that on there? Boy, that's a genius move. I hope you got a box of seals. No, wait a minute. There's always a trick. Go ahead and set that down on there, because it's going to stop. I'm going to take my handy piece of the same thing I pushed the bearing on and been using, and it fits right in, still pushing on the bearing. Doesn't hurt the seal, and I'll be able to tap that on there and install my yoke. And for anybody that cares, that's just 1 5/8 roll cage tubing. I think this is 120 wall, but 134 wall would work just fine. That's it. Nothing fancy, about 8 inches long. Okay, the operation was a success. When I filled the cavity of the seal, I also lubed the surface where the yoke's going to ride with the extra head laying around. The O-ring staying off for now because I have to check the depth in the housing. The O-ring goes here. If you watch my video, sometimes I miss with my hand. It's because I'm looking through my phone and not watching my finger direct, so it's a trick. I'm still not good at this video thing. My Detroit locker, 31 spline, showed up this morning UPS. And there's a few tricks about putting that together, where it's lightened and it's got a giant spring in it. They got it bolted together, but of course you can't get the ring gear on with that, so I'll show you what I do there. And why not? I'm going a little more in depth. The other 9-inch Ford video I did, I kind of rushed through it because I was humping right along. Today's kind of my day off, so I'm going a little bit slower. So we're going to take it all the way to the end. Right now I have to cook lunch because during this pandemic I'm also the chief cook and bottle washer, they say. I think today we're having chicken marinated with 80/90. See you in a few. All right, a little prep work on the case. This has got 10 bolt holes for the pinion support. 5 3/8, 5 7/16. They sell a pinion support that uses them all, but pinion support I'm using only takes 5 3/8. I just wind a couple studs in there for alignment. I spoke before about that tail bearing. That's a support bearing for the back of the pinion. This case has a nice snap ring that holds it in. That's never going anywhere. This is what Ford uses, this tanged washer, and you just drive it in on top of the bearing and hope it stays there. That's a hunk of something. I shop for case. I won't buy a case that won't take that if I have a choice. I stock these. I put a new one in every time. I don't trust it. If it falls out, or I guess nothing's really going to go anywhere, but that's a better idea. The shim has an arrow point on it, and some actually give the dimension of it. It's 18,000, so I'm going to start with that. Usually start around 20, it's close as I had. Now this will go on the case this way or this way. Either way, One way is going to put the number down there. I like it up there. That's just the way I do it. It drops on, but that arrow points that way. And if you look at the pinion support, it matches that. This Yukon through-bolt aluminum housing, 325 side bearing, came with the pinion support, and it came with these bolts to hold it in. I mentioned this in the other video. I just can't put that down on the aluminum housing, so I got bags of fasteners because I'm strange like that. I like nice fasteners. It's just the way I am. It'll work just fine with the other ones. My issue. Okay, I flipped it over. Removed the caps. These come nicely marked. 1 and 1 and 2 and 2. If your housing isn't marked, take a prick punch and prick 1 on one side and 2 on the other. On both halves. Where they meet. You know, back away from where they meet. A reasonable distance. So you put the caps back on where they belong. If you don't do that, the whole thing's junk. So that 113 pinion dimension is going to be from this imaginary line in the cap down to the back of the head of the pinion, down through that hole. I'm going to use a depth mic for that, but before I do that, there's no guarantee. I've mentioned before that this is split in half. Exactly. So you need to measure with my depth mic that half and the cap. In this case, they're the same. So now I can go ahead and measure the pinion depth. Alright, I've jockeyed my shims around. Ended up with a 6,000 shim, and I'm at 114. You're kind of at the mercy of what you have for shims. They don't come in 1,000 increments, but 114 on 113. We'll see what the pattern ends up like, but you got to be careful. I use the small end of the depth mic because you'll easily jack that up and get a false reading. I actually scooch right down and make sure it's not picking it up. And it works out. Okay, I've cleaned all the goo off the ring gear, and I've taken my old sharpening stone and shined up this surface, get it as flat and clean as possible. I did the same thing with the locker. I moved the bolts around that are holding the two halves together so I can clean under every one. Now, this is a giant spring, and because this is lightened and they've cut these scallops in here, normally there'd be an Allen-headed bolt, probably 1/4 inch, threaded from this case half down into this one to hold the halves together so you can just bolt the ring gear on. So if you see one of these in the wild and it's got scallops cut in it, it's a good chance you want to bolt the ring gear. She's going to come up in your face. I mean, I don't know how dramatic it would be, but it's a big spring. A couple 100 pounds probably. I think they come in different. I think these are 170 maybe. Anyway, let me show you what I do to hold it in place. Back in the press, just put some tension on it. I've already Loctited all my ring gear bolts. Now I can take the bolts with the nut off. Those bolts will hold it in place, and I'll just pick the ring gear up, start a few bolts, and we're golden. Alright, I tightened up the ring gear bolts, lubed up the bearings, set it in the case, started the adjusters. I have a favorite saying, there's no such thing as a bolt-on part. Well, wah, wah, wah. We got a clearance problem. I still got a 1/4 inch of backlash, so that's got to go this way more. And it's hitting the case. Now, it's a G-Force locker in a Yukon case. So I'll cut Yukon some slack. But a couple months ago, I did a Yukon Grizzly locker in this same Yukon case. Well, one just like it. And I had to grind the same area. I guess if I had my doubts, I should have ground it first, but you got to try it. So now the sad part is this thing's all clean, and now I got to bust it all apart, which doesn't take very long. Cover everything on the bench. Grind aluminum, which, makes a mess. Clean it all up, trial fit it, etc. I'll be back. And we're back. 6 times I ground, blew it off, vacuumed it up, cleaned it off with carb cleaner, reassembled, repeat, to finally get clearance for the locker. You want to be able to bring it up to 0 lash and back it off so you got room in the future. You don't want to take too much meat. So it's a problem. So, a few more assembly notes. These caps have pins where the halves join. An iron case, you don't. So in this case, with pins, I set the adjuster in the bottom half so it feels like it's right. You know, it spins back and forth easy. And if you can't push the cap all the way down flush by hand, it's wrong. I don't care what you think, or if the adjuster still spins, it will tighten up, it will not go all the way down, it'll break the cap. It has to go flush by hand. This goes for, with an iron case, I use the bolts as a guide. You know, hold the cap up, hold the gap, start the bolts, and set it down flush. If it doesn't go flush, it's wrong, I promise you. This was going together, it felt perfect, but it was all but a 1/16 of an inch at the bottom. It's wrong. So I fixed it, pushed it right down flush. I like to, and also with these wrist tight, that should spin easy. Another clue that those are wrong, if they don't. I like to get it so it's zero, and I like to work, you know, take a half turn out of that side, take a half turn this side, and start taking one notch at a time where this lines up. Till you get over where your backlash setting is going to be. A street backlash is bigger than race, typically 6 or 8 for a race car, 10 to 12 for a street car, because this whole thing's going to grow, especially being aluminum. Things can get tight. That's why they give you more backlash for the street. So I did all that 6 times. Ran a pattern, and this is where it gets subjective. It's a little sharp on the back, indicating the pinion might be too close, but I know I'm in by the measurement. The coast is okay too. It just comes down to opinion. Do you want to go with what's written? Or do you want to chase, you know, 3 or 4 thousand shim to make a change on the pattern, really? So you're going to make a pretty drastic change to try to change that. Let's be honest, all aftermarket ring and pinions are not all necessarily quiet. They do their best, but it is what it is. So I think I'm going to run it the way it is. It's a $120 ring gear. It'll be okay.